I think the status quo of the anime industry right now, which is to take pre-existing manga and then adapt them into fully fledged anime, has worked pretty well. The reason it's worked so well is because manga in general is a very malleable form of art, and the narratives and content of manga can be changed fairly easily. When you look back at the history of these two art forms, at things like Astro Boy and Yu Yu Hakusho, the narratives of these stories can be put into anime without losing any major details. The point of something like Astro Boy isn't lost because it's now an anime, so there's nothing wrong if you do adapt it. In fact, there may be some benefits. If you want to make an interesting story that has a message like Astro Boy's anti-war sentiment, manga is good, but only a certain amount of people would have the ability to read it. If you live in a Western country like me, there's a lot of stories that will not even get English translations, let alone physical copies. But even if you live in Japan, there are limits to the amount of copies made, distribution complications. Even in the age of technology, there are manga you just can't read. This isn't really the case in anime, where most of the shows are shown on TV and you can PVR the shows or watch them live. And any other show will be immortalized online in legal or illegal ways. Now that might make it seem like anime is the better art form, because it can be seen and enjoyed by the most amount of people, but that's not really the case. You see, where manga loses in its reach, it wins in cost of production. Not to say that anyone can do it, but relative to other art forms, manga doesn't take a whole lot to get off the ground. One person, a pencil, a piece of paper, and willpower are about all you need in order to start making the story you have always wanted to make, which is pretty cool. Of course, there's more to it than just a pencil and paper. You also need an eraser. But even then, it's nothing compared to the equipment and people needed to create an anime. Anime is usually made by large groups of people, depending on the project, hundreds of people in order to make one piece of One Piece. Compared to the one piece to make one piece, anime requires a lot of pieces, where each piece requires a lot of people and time. Both things that cost money through salaries and rent and advertisements and such. All this to say that manga is cheaper than anime. If the goal of animation studios is to ship out the most amount of good stories, the best solution is to borrow from stories that already exist. Adding to the production cost of anime by hiring a team of even more writers and creatives in order to make a perfect from-scratch world would be quite expensive. By taking the narrative of a manga, you're not only ensuring a narrative, but also an audience from the people who read and enjoyed it as a manga. The adaptation model of manga and anime is essentially a safety net for animation studios, but the product that they are making will be watched, which I think is the goal. I think there's something ruining modern art. All art is affected by this thing because it is something that is ever present in our lives, but some forms of art are getting affected by this thing more. Anime and manga are two forms affected by the presence of this thing, and yet it seems like people do not realize what exactly is going on. Partly because this thing has been a staple in our society for hundreds of years, but also because the changes this thing are making are so subtle and unnoticeable. If 2 centimeters are not much room for concern, the next 2 aren't either. Until you are meters away from where you started, yet another 2 centimeters is not much room for concern. Art started as an expression of how we as human beings see life. It is the interpretation of existence manifested into an unchanging artifact. From cave paintings to Damien Hirst, art is a way to analyze things that are going on in life, question if our way of existence is valid or how we may change that way of life. That is something only a human could do. A human who can look at the world around us and make a piece of art that reflects that world. And for the longest time, that was the goal of art. From the works of Michelangelo to Picasso to Hals, art was used to represent life. But there is a problem in this process of creation, where the artists make something like a painting or a novel, and those pieces of art require paint or a printing press. For a time, that's fine. People can create the art they want to see, and people can view the art they want to see. But when an artist runs out of paint, or a developer cannot pay their staff, what then? In oil painting, artists tend to paint their next piece using the funds of donors who fancied their art and were interested in seeing the next one. Which is fair. But if a painting only gives them enough to paint, how will they pay for the house they live in, the food they eat, the atelier for their craft? Well, they must seek more patrons, more people who like their craft, and from there they can afford to make a living and afford to make their art. But at some point in the pursuit of money and patrons, an artist must shift their art, not to change it entirely, but change its contents, its composition, to appease the audience of patrons, at which point, art has lost its meaning. If an artist is changing their perception of the world, focusing it in certain places, or only depicting the things that other people want to see, the message of art will fade, or the message becomes one the viewer wants to hear rather than the artist wants to tell. And while that is a bastardization of art and its goals, you cannot fault the artist because they must pay the bills. As art has become more and more directed towards what the viewer wanted to see instead of what the artist wanted to paint, you get commissions. Commissioned portraits, commissioned statues, art pieces to be held in homes rather than museums. Do you think these painters wanted to paint the nobility, or do you think it was just so that the artist could pay for their next meal? We all love to see ourselves in our art, and some people are willing to pay a lot to see that happen. Wouldn't it be nice to get away, escape this life, and live in a fantasy world where everything's alright? Doesn't that sound nice? The most watched anime each season is usually an escapist fantasy, an isekai or a high fantasy depicting a world much different from our own. And while that could be the result of a group of artists analyzing, recreating, and responding to a social need for escapism, it could also be that those artists are simply responding to their patrons' desires. Slop is what it is, and the system of adapting manga into anime is the system that allows this slop to be made. We all want to see ourselves in art, no matter how good or bad it is. A lower floor for quality, a cheaper product to make, the endless struggle for profit means that we must streamline the process down to a point where we are telling these same stories over and over again. We can keep pulling from the seemingly endless database of manga to appease that desire, and the artist can't help but make it, for they have a lease to pay, a family to feed, and a paintbrush to buy. This is a loonie, named after the iconic loon on its face. And it's also the thing I think is ruining anime and manga. I think the system of adapting manga into anime is good. Not only because it allows for a steady input of content, but also because it is actively making better anime and manga. But this actually goes much farther than just anime and manga, and I would include both light novels and video games into that argument because this process affects all levels of the pipeline, not just the ones that are most popular. This is a website called Shosetsuka ni Naro, translated to Become a Novelist, which is the birthplace of a lot of light novels. Like, a lot. Like so many light novels. The reason many light novel authors congregate on this website are twofold: ease of access and high traffic. It is extremely easy to start posting on this website. They make a funny point that literally anyone can sign up, even if you're a housewife. The content you are able to make is pretty broad. You can make a poem or a Tolkien-esque novella, as long as it's not infringing pretty understandable content guidelines like telling readers how to make explosives, you're good. And because of that ease of entry, this website became a place where all kinds of novelists would self-publish their work for anyone to see. And it turns out when you do that, you also congregate all types of viewers. A feedback loop that grows both the artists and audience, creating a massive monolith of digital publication and a safe haven for a lot of light novels. Some stories to come out of this are things like That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, Mushoku Tensei, So I'm a Spider, So What, The Eminence in Shadow, and probably 30 other shows that you recognize the title of. So some pretty reputable narratives have come from this website. But it's not this website's massive catalog that I'm interested in, however fascinating it is to look through. Rather, it's how that massive library organizes itself from stories people really like to stories people don't like. This website is pretty much just a place for all novelists to post their stuff. The growth of a series happens naturally through word-of-mouth recommendations as well as personal interest. You can glean some very interesting information thanks to the website being formatted like this. Because growth is natural and views are given based on enjoyment of a series rather than artificial inflation, the stories with the most amount of views can be seen as the best light novels. Of course, best is subjective and each person will like different things, but if one show is good enough to get a huge crowd behind it, it means that the novel was doing something right. And the numbers don't lie. This creates a sort of merit system where the readers, the general population, can vote on what is the best story by reading the good stories and not reading the not good ones. And for a company who is interested in making manga that the most people will enjoy, a site where readers vote on what's best is great, because it means you can take that narrative and have confirmation it will be a good manga. And for a company who is interested in making a manga that the most amount of people will enjoy, a site where readers vote on what's the best is great, because it means you can take that narrative and have confirmation that it will be a good manga. That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime is currently the second best light novel? Well, then let's make it into a manga that people will also like. Eminence in Shadow is really popular right now? Well, make that a manga. It's a pretty good system, often called a meritocracy, where only the best of the best are able to be promoted to the next thing because they have shown that they can be successful in that new position. Pretty much everyone in this system is happy. The authors that made the novels, the readers, its publishers, and artists of the successful works are happy, and they've earned that happiness by making a good story. The unsuccessful, the novelists who are stuck grinding away at their series, are probably not going to be too happy that another story was picked over theirs to become a manga, but that unhappiness is used as motivation for them to create even better art and learn from the series that were successful. Those that have created the best light novels can be promoted into a manga, while those who don't can try again. This continues on with the stories that become manga as well, as at this point the manga is probably successful thanks to it being an already existing IP with a dedicated fan base. But manga isn't the end. There is an even more prestigious, more important form this story can take. So for the manga, which get the most views and have the merit of the people, they become anime. And if you're really spicy, that anime could then become a video game, rewarding the artists and authors who make a good story by giving them an anime adaptation can and will push those that don't make good stories to get better, while also giving us, the consumer, content that has proven to be good by having it pass the checks of being a good light novel and being a good manga first. I think manga and anime are fundamentally different forms of art, and the culture of taking pre-existing manga and adapting them into anime is making worse anime and worse manga. Anime and manga have always relied on each other. They come as two peas in a pod for most people, thanks to their similarities being made in the same place, having similar stories and art styles, but I'd argue that thought process is wrong and maybe even harmful. When analyzing art, there is a lot of things you need to take into consideration, but there are two main ones. The content of the art is, of course, important. The story, its characters, how it made you feel, its message, are all things you need to analyze and be critical of. On the other end of the spectrum, you have to be critical of the form in which that content takes. The technical ability of the painter, the feeling of character movement, the act of turning a page, all these things are important as well. Unfortunately, those two camps tend to be compartmentalized within people's thoughts. Analyses will often talk about how the setting of this novel was really good, but the writing capabilities were wrong, or how the gameplay was really addicting, but had no narrative. To most people, those two things, content and form, never interact. They are analyzed, thought of, and expressed into unique and separate sentences. That's not okay. At least it's not okay if you actually want to think critically about a piece of art. If you want to truly analyze art, you have to not compartmentalize content and form. You have to look at those two as things that relate to one another. How the brush strokes might represent something within the art, or how the artist was feeling when making it. You have to look at how a story is being told, and analyze how the form that you are consuming that story in is connected to the narrative. How it might say something about how a character is feeling, or better understand the world that they live in. That level of analysis collapses when you hit manga and anime. Anime is an art form that should theoretically be able to show off a lot of interesting and unique stories. The fact that anime is animated should mean that creativity is the only thing that limits the content of a show. That is the thing that animation is billed as. This art form was made to fulfill the supernatural, fantastical, and fictional stories that were incredibly hard to make in live action. Anime carved a niche for itself by being so out there and unique. Manga doesn't get that same kind of glory. It is an art that is more constricted in its form, being still, mostly black and white, needing to be read instead of animated, but manga deserves its flowers as well. Manga, as well as any other drawn or painted art form, has the potential to show minute detail that is extremely hard, nigh impossible to show in a moving anime. Anime requires a lot of frames of art to be drawn in order to make the illusion of movement. The standard frame rate of anime is 24 frames per second, but not every one of those frames is a new image, It ends up being around 8 to 12 frames per second. That still means that to make one shot of animation, no camera cuts or anything, you are still going to need dozens, if not hundreds, of individual frames in order to create the illusion of motion. Whereas in manga, it's one, maybe 2 or 3 in order to create a shot or whatever the equivalent is in manga. Anime tends to flatten out the art process and spends as little time as needed on a single frame because there are many more frames that need to be drawn, as well as some that need more attention than others. A sad result of this is that there's a lot less detail in animation. Complex designs that were really important in the manga get desaturated when adapted into animation, because you cannot spend time on each intricate detail when there are 10,000 more frames to draw in a single episode. This means that manga can have art like this, or this, and still be fairly sustainable because you are only doing this every once in a while, not for multiple frames spanning over multiple seconds. And the separation of detail between manga and anime affects not only the large cinematic shots, but also the small and less important ones. Oh no! Having to create motion where there wasn't any originally is difficult, and trying to capture the same feeling a still picture had in motion is even more difficult. It seems like adaptation culture in anime isn't going to be going away anytime soon, as it seems like we are seeing less and less original anime in favor of anime that have already been a manga, visual novel, or webtoon. It is ingrained in Japanese culture that manga will be adapted into anime. But what does that culture create? Well, it creates a mindset that manga is not the end goal of a story, that there exists a more prestigious place for the story to rest. A consequence of that thought process is understanding that when you are drawing a manga, you have to make sure that the fine details are able to be translated into anime. No more intricate details on a page because that's hard to animate. No more playing with the act of flipping a page because animation is viewed linearly. No using text in interesting ways because it will eventually become a voice line anyways. When I talk about the intersection of content and form, I ultimately hope that the viewer can point out how that intersection is used in interesting ways. See how interesting Nier Automata is, or how unique Purple Hyacinth is. Unfortunately, the content of anime and manga are not made to stay in the art forms they were created in. The intersection between content and form doesn't exist, because the form is expected to change. As an art critic who likes to see both manga and anime push the boundaries of their respective art form, it pains me to see the simplification of stories just so that they can be applied to the most amount of media. I am hopeful for the future of these art forms. The bubble has to burst eventually, but as for right now, I think we need to draw a line between anime and manga.